In the orientation of faith, the story we get is, the earth is the Lord's. In other words, it all belongs to God. Our money and our stuff is owned by God, and we are stewards. I'm going to talk about the meaning of stewards in just a bit. But we're stewards for God's purposes. Our offerings in worship represent returning to God a portion of what already belongs to God in the first place. What we keep also belongs to God, and we're obligated to use it wisely. This is what the faith has taught us from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament, through the history of the Christian church. When we give gifts, it's for the purpose of investing in God's work. And rather than thinking God ought to be grateful for our generosity, we're grateful for the privilege of using what belongs to God while we're here on earth, and the privilege of leaving a legacy once we're gone. This is what our orientation of faith teaches us about to whom does our money and stuff ultimately belong. Where does this idea come from? Well, the psalmist in Psalm 24 that Olivia read says, "The earth is the Lord's, and all that's in it, the world and those who live in it." Look at your front cover of your bulletin, and you get a picture of what that means. From the perspective of faith, since God is the creator, God is the source of all, it all belongs to God. That's how people of faith reason. God created it, God's the source of it, it all belongs to God. Well, some of us can say that's marvelous, but God didn't build my house. I built my house. God didn't build this automobile and pay for it. God didn't do the work that I do when I'm at work that brings me a salary that means I can do all these great and wonderful things. That's where we get the answer from Deuteronomy 8:11 through 18. Olivia read, "Do not say to yourself, 'My power and the might of my own hand have gotten me this wealth.' But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth, so that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your ancestors, as he is doing today." The notion is God is not only the creator and the source of all, but God is the source of all our abilities and the resources that we have that allow us to live a more comfortable life. The word comfort came in over here. This is the way people of faith tell us to understand things. In other words, there's no room left for me to imagine that I'm the source of my good life. The proper response to the blessings of this life is not to pat myself on the back and find a way to get more stuff. The proper response, the faith response tells us, is to give God the glory and ask the serious questions about how I am called to use what God has entrusted to me. The primary metaphor for the first orientation was consumer. The primary metaphor for this orientation is steward, or to use a C word so you can remember it alongside consumer, caretaker. Think in terms of either a consumer or a caretaker, which comes out of the notion of being a steward. The English word steward developed from the 11th century English word meaning keeper of the sty, keeper of the pigsty. Now, how does that connect? Well, the keeper of the sty was the manager of the owner's resources. The animals that lived there were the source of their wealth, were the source of their comfort, were the source of their food, were the source of the way they were perceived in the community. And the keeper of the sty, this manager, this caretaker, this steward, was a very important person alongside the owner. And it's not that we don't acknowledge the word steward in our lives today, or even the idea of stewardship. You know, I've read books recently in the business world, not the church world, but the business world. Peter Block wrote a marvelous book called Stewardship. The concept is being used in business in a way that it's not being used in the church, and that's a shame. We use it, the word stewardship, to name a committee in the church, right? A committee on which nobody wants to serve, right? Okay. The concept exists among us. We use the word, we title a committee by it. The concept exists among us, but in a state of harmlessness. You know, it's being used in business, it's being used in environmentalism to encourage folks not to be harmless in their stewardship of these things, but to motivate folks to actually do something that's helpful. It's a radical concept for developing the Christian way of life. Douglas John Hall, who's written a monograph about stewardship, says it must be understood first as descriptive of the being, the very life of God's people. Deeds of stewardship arise out of the being of a steward. To whom does it all belong? God doesn't need our money, but God entrusts it to us that we might grow in our relationship with God and with the community of people with whom we live and work.